This episode is sponsored by the Vining Center, a contemplative community growing your soul and serving our world in the mountains of North Carolina and online everywhere. Welcome to Growing Up Evangelical, conversations on an evolving faith. Each week I'm talking with folks about how the evangelical church shaped their lives in ways good and not so good, and where they find themselves today. If you feel like a church refugee, maybe disappointed or disillusioned with that, but you're still all about Jesus, we are your peeps. Here in this space, you will make sense of your own journey and be inspired toward the next step. Thanks for showing up. So tell us, Brandon, tell us, who are you? And
No pressure.
tell us everything about you and a little bit about your organization, Naming the Real.
Sure. Well, I'm married to Becca. I'm a father of three. Charlotte, Layton, and Asa. We live in Brevard, North Carolina, which we love.
Ooh,
About 2 hours from you.
yeah.
And my wife and I run an organization called Naming the Real. The idea is you can't change or transform what you're not aware of. So naming is a huge active. Courage, any change process starts with an act of naming. And we work with people in all sorts of domains to really transform their life from the inside out. We do that through large group trainings, through individual coaching, and through creation of resources. So you can check out my podcast, Naming the Real, wherever you get your podcasts. But our vision is to stand with people to recreate, reinvent their lives through courageous naming and facing what they need to face. And then I do some other coaching work. That's the heart of what we do at Naming the Real.
That's awesome. And your URL for the ministry?
NamingTheReal.com.
There it is. Okay. You know, it seemed like the most obvious and immediate point of convergence for us was around this idea of a third way. You're already doing a podcast series on that right now.
This series on the third way is really looking at the spirituality of our politics. And I think most people would agree we're in a malaise politically in the U.S. And how did we get here? What's happening in our spirituality? So looking at some of the spiritual and sociological underpinnings of how we came to this moment where everything seems to be in breakdown is the current series.
Okay. So we've got the spiritual, political side of things. I'm kind of coming at it from a bit of the mystical Christian wisdom tradition that talks a lot about the law of three, and that's something we'll chat about here in a bit. But I wonder, if maybe we could begin this conversation about growing up evangelical.
Great.
Let's
do it.
Yeah. Tell me.
Just two former evangelicals.
Yeah, exactly. And, there are a lot of people.
More every day.
More every day of people that, for various reasons, I think, still have spiritual hunger, still love Jesus, love the idea maybe of church, but their actual experience of church has been hard because church is people and we're people, and that's a messy business. So sometimes folks feel like they have to kind of flee that, either because of theological constraints or because it maybe feels a little too ingrown and not vested enough in the larger world community. Maybe a little bit too tribal exclusive. You've got to think like us, be like us, live like us. Maybe it was just good old fashioned, they weren't nice to me. Or
maybe all of the above.
Maybe all of the above, yeah. I think for me it was probably mostly theological, because actually most of my personal experiences in church have been positive. And I know a lot of really wonderful, dear evangelical friends. Tell us just a little bit about what was it like for you growing up evangelical, and why did that change for you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I really like what Richard Rohr says about former evangelicals, that people who grew up evangelical can often become some of the healthiest, funnest people to be around. I might have added the fun part, but some of the healthiest people he knows, because they're given such a clear box, which we need developmentally, that right, wrong, in, out, up, down orientation, without which a life really becomes untethered. I feel really grateful that I grew up evangelical because I was taught so many things that I still believe.
Yes.
Your life matters. You can make a difference, an eternal difference in the world. We ultimately live in a benevolent universe, a moral universe. I mean, so many things that I still ascribe to. I think where it started to break down for me was the purity codes and the purity culture.
Okay.
And I don't just mean sexual, although we all know that that was a whole movement in certainly in the 90s, and I Kissed Dating Goodbye and all that whole purity culture, sexual purity movement. But the ways of, I remember when I went to Wheaton College because I was a good evangelical.
Oh, yes.
And I remember as soon as I got to college, everything kind of fell apart for me. I thought I was going to this Christian utopia. I had had an incredible, a legit, charismatic Pentecostal experience. A truly remarkable experience. And so I thought I'd kind of arrived. I was going to Wheaton, and then the bottom fell out. I got incredibly depressed. I had so much trauma from my family and just dysfunction that I couldn't hold it together anymore. The ship just broke apart. So I spent about 6 years from my freshman year into my 20s processing through a depression. And that was really the deconstruction of my evangelicalism as well. But I remember when I was at Wheaton, I said to a friend of mine, I said, she said, "How you doing?" I said, I'm just really struggling." And she said, "You're always struggling." I thought, yeah, thank you. And it was good feedback. She wasn't wrong. I was pretty dour, but part of the message I got was, yeah, I don't fit the sort of purity pattern, the notion of if you do things right, your life should work out. If you believe the right things about God, everything's going to work out. My life was not working out. I was depressed. I had done some things that I was ashamed of. I didn't know how to clean them up, and basically, I left evangelicalism because it was very pragmatic. They stopped working. Evangelicalism stopped working for me.
Wow.
And I don't mean that in some sort of, selfish sense, but we all need our spirituality and our sort of schemas to work in the real world. And they didn't. I started to find the answers insufficient to deal with the pain of the world, the crisis of the world. And so I had to find a new ship. I never lost my faith in the divine, never lost my faith in God, never lost my faith in the reality of Jesus, definitely lost my faith in the church. And so I went through probably a 6-year period of really deconstructing that. Ended up becoming a pastor, was never planning on it. So I never fully left the church, but I'm probably in my mid-20s, I stopped considering myself an evangelical. And now what the term evangelical has come to mean to me is more of a sociological term. It's not even really a theological term. What evangelicalism has become with the rabid support of Donald Trump. And, I'm not trying to make this conversation political, but I understand people voting for Donald Trump for all sorts of reasons. But the rabid support and the sort of messianic fervor around someone who and claiming that he was sent by God, as I've seen so many evangelicals do, to me is sort of the death knell of evangelicalism as not only a religious movement, but as a sociological movement. So anyway, that's more than you asked, but that was, I feel grateful that I grew up evangelical. I feel really grateful to have left evangelicalism as well.
Like, I think many evangelicals still feel like it is a theological posture, and it has its theological content. But yeah, the way it has positioned itself in the world. If you just go, person on the street, what do you think of evangelicalism? They're going to tell you MAGA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're going to tell you hypocrites, don't like gays,
Yes.
MAGA. Yeah. All those things.
All of those things, which is, talk about a tragedy. Talk about something that just makes me want to sink into a depression myself.
Yeah. But then on the flip side, how much this is the purity culture piece of it, the desperate need for humans to have something that allows them to feel pure and good and therefore worthy. That what feels like a tragedy to you, This is part of what I wrestled with so many things, how we look at the same we humans can look at dots and connect them so differently,
Yes.
and how what you're saying, it's a tragedy to an evangelical, and this is not me throwing anybody under the bus or even being critical. It's just something I wrestle with, how to them it feels like, no, this is how you're pure. Never did I hear the sermon, hey, the Gospels, the four Gospels are really teaching us to be aware of the religiously rigid, because that's who killed Jesus. Like, hey, that's us, guys. We're like the fervent, potential zealots.
Yeah.
How might we miss Christ in our midst? It was never that. It was always, we believe, the unbelievers outside don't believe. And really, if you look at the sociological message of the Gospels, there's a huge part of it is beware of those who are zealous in the name of God. They're the most likely to do evil in the name of God. I never heard that message. It's wild to me how differently we can connect the dots.
Yeah. It's so true. And that, I mean, I can feel you have a real grace on you for talking about these challenges of getting along and talking about difficult topics. You carry that with grace
Oh, thank
and
you.
understanding.
Thank you for that affirmation. That's meaningful to me. And I think of, Jesus on the cross. Jesus. There's a time where he rails against religious hypocrisy. There's a time where he's silent before it because there's nothing you can do or say. And there's a time where he says, Father, forgive them. And I love at the end, the Father, forgive them is they're humans,
Yeah.
they're doing the best they can. And to have that, for all of us to have that posture,
Hmm.
and to have that posture when we ourselves are being dehumanized, seems to be the message of the cross, to not pick up, a metaphorical stone in response, how to have that posture of Christ.
Mm.
That seems to be our work.
Yes, it does. And if we're going to represent Jesus well in our world, which it really is, always has been the hope of the world, then we need to kind of look and feel like Jesus,
Yeah.
And he was, although he was willing to call a spade when it came to, as you say, the religious establishment, he was such an includer. I've been just thinking about how Jesus brought
Incredible.
together, former zealots
It's
and
incredible.
tax collectors and, the wealthy and, Zacchaeus and just all these folks who had almost nothing in common except their humanity.
We have no concept for how radical it is for Matthew, a tax collector, working with the Roman authorities, and Simon, a zealot, to be in the same band together is so insane. It's like, it would be like having a MAGA Republican together with sort of a bleeding heart liberal. That's a phrase from the 90s. Remember that, bleeding heart?
Yes. Oh, yes.
I think it was Rush Limbaugh. It's just pretty much in probably like a transgender, man and a MAGA Republican being held together in this common conversation. It's sort of really hard for us to understand how radical the inclusion was. Absolutely.
Mind boggling.
Hmm.
So, do you think that the world really is more divided now? Or is that just kind of the optics because that's where we are in it?
Yeah, I think I really like Todd Rose's work around collective illusion. And collective illusion is basically this notion that we believe things about our neighbors that are not true based on the algorithm. One thing about social media and the news, Neil Postman was right. The news cycle has basically become entertainment.
Yes.
He saw this, in the 80s. I mean, now it's to the nth degree. It's just entertainment. It's outrage. It's playing on people's amygdala to give them an emotional feeling, which boosts ratings. And so how do you boost outrage? You find the most extreme representation of the other side.
Okay.
So the other side, Republicans might have a story about how the Democrats, I remember that story that James Tallarico talked about in Texas, how there was this false story that Democrats were pushing for litter boxes for kids who thought they were animals, who self-identified as animals. None of it was true, but right, it was this extreme story that was made like it was representational of the left. And the same thing happens
Yeah.
to the right, and so it ends up creating what Todd Rose calls, I mean, that's one of the factors that creates collective illusion, which is that we believe things about other people that actually they don't believe. That
Mm.
actually the average American, of course, are there crazies and loonies and extremists? Yes, on both sides, left and right. But the average American is actually pretty thoughtful, is actually pretty moderate, and there's actually quite a bit of agreement. But that doesn't make for a good news cycle,
Yeah.
and that doesn't make for good polarization, which doesn't drive social media attention. So I think it's largely illusion that we're so divided. However, today's collective illusions, and this is something Todd Rose says, today's illusions, collective illusions, become tomorrow's realities. And so I think we're on the road to division. I think as the algorithm reinforces our silos left and right,
Hmm.
progressive and conservative, we will become more and more divided. So I don't think it's as bad as we think, but I think we are well on our way. Is that fair?
Yeah, it does feel fair to me, which is, you know, disruptive and concerning. I mean, I hope it concerns everyone equally. I don't know. You know, it doesn't feel like a world that anybody would just want to live in.
Yeah.
Something that is just sort of veiled hostility and barely constrained violence.
Yeah, where we're trained to dehumanize our neighbors.
Yeah.
And we're trained to victimize ourselves that the other side is so bad, which ultimately will justify our doing violence against those who are other and different. Yeah, it's a very intense. And I think this is not a Republican Democrat issue
No.
to me. To me, Donald Trump is illustrative of so many of these dynamics that we're talking about to a degree that no other president has ever been. The dehumanization you witness in Donald Trump's rhetoric is so illustrative of what's happening in our society. The way that we're being trained to dehumanize the other side
Yes.
is is alarming, and I don't think that's a partisan issue.
So, what's a third way? What's an alternative to that kind of in some sense you can't fight the media. So
Yeah.
how it's just too big and too vested in dollars. How do we personally for ourselves live
Hmm.
into a different way of being, and how can we possibly do that collectively?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. Um, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with, again, you can't transform something you're not aware of. So to name it, which we can't do when we're caught in our tribal politics, because the outrage feels so good to be outraged that a lot of there's less and less thinking that goes on as citizens in America. I think there's data for that, right? That our attention span is going down. Um, you don't really think in the outrage cycle. You just react and respond. So I know that part of it has to do, or I believe part of it has to do with naming, doing this naming, and doing it in the way of Christ, actually, without judgment, without hatred, without rancor and bitterness. We're really challenging when we witness some of the craziness on both extremes, right and left. I think right now I think I'm more aware of the craziness on the right for obvious reasons. But the naming of those dynamics is the first step to recognize that we're being trained to do violence and to scapegoat the other side. To use Rene Girard's language, that we're being trained to other and to ultimately scapegoat and act in violence to those who are different than us. How do you step out of the machinery of that system is to name it. The idea of the third way is sociological movements, thankfully, don't take, you know, 100% buy-in. They don't take 50% buy-in. You can start a movement with, what is it that, Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell. I can't remember whose research his work was based on, but what is it? 10 to 17% is enough to start a sociological movement that can take on a critical mass has a domino effect. So it's to me, and sometimes this may feel like spitting into the wind, but it's inviting people to step out of the binary, to not see it as to critique your own side,
Mm.
to recognize that you cannot be taken seriously if you're a partisan in this day and age, that both sides need to be critiqued. There's things to critique on the left, there's things to be critiqued on the right. And if we can create a movement of people who just opt out of this radical tribalism and find a new way of being people, again, that feels like a tall order in our society. But my dream is what could come of that if we had enough people who started pushing back against these false binaries of left and right, Republican, Democrat. I think part of what would happen is we would start demanding third-party candidates that are more viable. And I think that we can also change the conversation so that the candidates we do get, including Republican and Democrat candidates, are better and are not just ideologues. I think Kamala Harris, for example, to me, I didn't experience a lot of thinking from her. She seemed mostly like an ideologue on the left. And I think that's what both parties are creating more and more, is just ideologues. An ideologue on this side to counter the ideologue on this side. What would it mean to have candidates who are just more thoughtful? I think the only way towards that is to normalize getting out of the binary. It occurred to me, what about you as you think about that question, wonderful question you're posing? How do you think we get beyond the binaries?
I've been really conscious of this on a personal level. I was introduced to this idea of the law of three probably 15 years ago. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But it's been more recently that I've recognized that this concept shapes the way we show up in the world across the board, the way we show up in our relationships, and just even internally, kind of the way we manage our own internal parts. The internal critic and and then that hopeful part of us. And sometimes I have felt like just in my own personal journey that I'm riding the gas and the brake at the same time. In the sense, like sometimes I just want more. I want to feel like I'm having more impact, and other times I just feel like, yikes, more. I'm going to lose my soul, and I just need to go on retreat, which is one of my favorite things, and just be this pseudo monk. But there is this mediating force, this reconciling force in the wisdom tradition. They set it up as sort of an affirming force, a denying force, and then this reconciling third. And I've really been trying to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Again, really just mostly for myself so far. But I think it absolutely applies on the larger communal dimension. So I've just been trying to notice my reactivity, whether that's political or my coping mechanisms, my self-soothing mechanisms, my desire to engage, and then how anxiety can flare, and looking for that. What's the message, the internal self-talk that bridges these extremes, that moves me from trying to either be aggressive or withdrawing, self-protective or a little bit combative. I mean, my personality is to be a nice guy, so I'm rarely in people's faces overtly. It all happens underneath the covers of my skin, And yet it's not any less destructive. Maybe it's a little less destructive, but it's still destructive. And so I have been really talking to God a lot about, we could say the third way, I think in a very real sense, is the way of love. But love is such a
squishy term.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I love my wife, but I also love tacos. So it's a broad word.
And we can talk about loving the left and loving the right, and even, God help us, loving Donald Trump. But what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point, because we think of love and it can be this sentimentality, and love can actually look quite fierce. And when we talk about, like, term that I use is unitive centrism, that unitive centrism is this belief that the other side has something that's essential for my argument. And it doesn't mean that each side is equally right. And it doesn't mean that we have to be mealy-mouthed centrists and just, compromise in the middle.
Yeah.
That we can be really fiercely partisan, but the bridge is that I acknowledge you see something, the failure of which or my inability to see will actually be a critical failure for my argument. So I think if you look at any political issue, that's true. Now we're being trained to pretend that's not the case. No, we're all right. If you would just do things exactly the way that we see it, everything would be fine. No, the other side. So if you're a Republican, the Democrats have something for you. If you're a Democrat, the Republicans have something for you. That sort of normalizing that reality to me is one of the hopes of being a unitive centrist. So on a practical level, I think if we can grasp that, there's a lot of hope. When you were talking though, Jerome, it reminded me a lot of the work I do with my coaching clients is around internal family systems, which I won't try to, I could nerd out on that, but there's an exiled, we have different parts. One might be a really wounded, exiled, lonely part. Then we have manager parts that protect the system from the exile's overwhelm. And in the rule of thirds there, it's often the true self, which is not a part, but like this energy within us at the core of us. I think it's made in the part of us that's made in the image of God, is able to bring that whole system to balance and integrate both of the wounded parts and the protector parts into itself, which creates something far greater than, 1+1+1 equaling 3. It's a totally different type of energy. So I think you're absolutely right. Is we experience this sort of reckoning within ourselves. And then I think as a society, we experience the rule of 3. And, it's very Hegelian. Hegel talked about you have a synthesis, then you have an antithesis. And they seem to be, irreconcilable. But then out of that tension comes a new synthesis.
Yes.
And then there's an antithesis, and that's how history progresses, is through this tension. It's unitive centrism, right? It's like you need that tension between synthesis, antithesis, right and left, conservatives, progressives, Republicans. You need that tension. The greatest lie that we've been sold is that tension is somehow abnormal, that one side is right and the other side is evil. So like going back to your question, it's how do we normalize the fact that this tension is actually what allows us to progress? And if Democrats won all the way out, we'd be screwed. And if Republicans win all the way out, we're going to be screwed, because that's not the nature of reality. The nature of reality at its core is this tension of opposites, of opposing forces. How do we create that sort of appreciation? How do we get people out of the dehumanization of the other side, and into an appreciation? That would be a game changer if we could do that.